Over the years, peer groups have gotten more and more attention. Public companies are required to specify a peer group in every annual proxy statement. Investors focus on peer groups to help in assessing the relative attraction of various stocks. But the real question is, how do we know we're looking at the right peer group? Are there tools to help select the right peers? Welcome to PriceTarget Research. I'm John Lafferty. In this video, we're going to talk about peer groups, typical uses of peer groups, how they're determined, and an unconventional approach to help investors find the right peers. Peer groups are typically used for business benchmarking, for comparison of investment returns. In fact, proxy statements have a required chart in them that show the particular company's investment performance relative to its peer group. And the peer groups are also used by the compensation committee of the board of directors in support of compensation decisions. Common criteria for selecting peers, all over the map. Probably the most frequently used criterion is if the company is in the same industry group as the company in question. A factor which has begun to get more attention is competition for talent. Companies that are in the marketplace trying to hire the same individuals typically get used as peers. There's also a reputational aspect of peers for some companies, trying to, and in fact it relates to aspirations, setting up as a peer and maybe a target companies with sterling reputations and wonderful business results. What's missing in all of this, however, are any consideration of investment characteristics or operating characteristics, and those are things obviously that investors are very interested in. So let's look at some different approaches to picking the right peer group, and see if we can't talk about a new novel approach which should be quite helpful to investors. To examine typical approaches to defining peer groups, it seemed like fun to pick on Apple. Everybody knows Apple, a very prominent company, obviously. And we will go through several different approaches to identification of peer groups and see if one in particular does a better job for investors. So we're going to start initially with the notion of companies that operate in the same industry, which is a very logical approach to picking peers, is to find companies that do what the company in question does. So here is Apple's peer group. You'll notice it's communications equipment, lots of very small companies, some bigger ones. Several years ago, Apple would have been more of a computer company, and you could argue that this iPhone is really a miniature computer, but they're now grouped with other companies that make telephones. And it is an interesting group, but as you'll see, it's not particularly good in terms of companies that have a lot in common with Apple. So let's look at a methodology for establishing how similar companies are to Apple. Let's start off with a grid. The vertical axis is going to represent how well a company compares to Apple in terms of investment characteristics, things like growth, profitability, valuation, financial strength, that sort of thing. The horizontal axis would be operating characteristics, profit margins, return on capital, tax rates, financial leverage, that sort of thing. And you can think of companies as falling on this grid, and when the two factors are plotted together, you can get an overall measure of how well a company stacks up against Apple. The axes have labels on them running, in this case, from 50 to 100. Actually, the similarity to Apple would range all the way from 0 to 100, but we're just showing the top half. So a score of 100 on investment characteristics would mean that a company is identical to Apple in terms of investment characteristics. And similarly, a score of 100 on the operating characteristics would say that a company is exactly like Apple when it comes to operations. So you can think about putting companies on this grid and seeing where their overall score is. The white triangle in the upper right-hand corner would be all of the combinations of operating characteristic similarity and investment similarity that would yield an overall score of 90. The blue shaded bar under it would be all the combinations of 80. And we say that in order for a company to be considered a close peer, it should have an overall score of 80 or above. When you look at the communications peer group, you can see that there aren't a lot of high scores. In fact, this is a very weak choice for a peer group. Nothing has got a score above 80, and in fact, when you remove all of the non-80 scores from the chart, you're left with nothing. There are no peers that have a good match with Apple on that basis. So we would argue that looking at a industry group to find peers is not a particularly fruitful way of looking for peers. Now, another approach, and in fact Apple adopted this approach in its proxy statement for its most recent fiscal year, would be to focus on companies with whom Apple competes for talent and companies with sterling reputations. Obviously, Apple's got a wonderful reputation and has top-notch people. From their proxy statement, there are two peer groups that result from their approach. One is the primary peer group you can see on the lower left, and then on the right is kind of a secondary group. These are companies that have less of a business resemblance to Apple than the ones on the left, but have sterling reputations and would be aspirational in terms of their benchmarking. Plotting those companies on the same grid, you'll notice there's about 22 or 24 of them. And there are some to the upper right, but you'll notice that a lot of these companies are coming in under 80, which is again not a very good score. So eliminating them, you eliminate at least half of the companies which Apple has self-identified as peers. They just aren't very similar. A third approach would be to look at companies that have high combined scores, companies that have very similar investment characteristics as well as very similar operating characteristics. So we're looking for companies that would be, if you will, up and to the right in the grid. So we're going to take the prospect universe, thousands of companies. We're going to look at how well each of the companies match up with Apple on an investment basis, valuation, growth, profitability, risk, etc., and on an operational basis with return on capital, margins, and so on. We're going to come up with a series of candidates, and then if it was an important thing to do, you could also then filter for size and for companies in the same industry. But we didn't do that here. We're just going to look at the companies that have the highest combined score matching up very well with Apple. And you'll notice here that we're talking about companies then that would be in the upper right-hand quadrant up there, or the shaded area. So here is, in fact, that group of companies with the highest scores. They're all above 80. There's no company below 80. There's a bunch of them in the 90s. These are companies that compare very favorably with Apple on both an investment and an operating basis. It's also interesting when you look at the names, however, that a lot of them are kind of unconventional. In particular, I thought it was interesting that MasterCard and Visa both show up as peers. And you'd say, initially, what do they have in common? Interestingly, Visa had already been selected by Apple in one of its the peer groups in its proxy statement. So these are companies with a very high resemblance to Apple on investment and operating characteristics. The advantages to the investor, obviously you can continue to do business benchmarking and comparison of investment returns just as is done in the proxy statement. But a key element here is new investment ideas. You can think of the members of peer groups selected this way as substitutes for a company in the portfolio. Specifically, if you owned Apple, and let's say it had become an oversized holding, you wanted to find other companies that had similar sorts of profile, but where you could begin to diversify some part of that investment. That would be a good use of this new peer group. These are, in fact, then new investment ideas, companies that could be considered to be included in the portfolio, and which resembled very closely the Apple stock that was already in the portfolio. So that is a run through of PriceTarget Research's approach to identification of peer groups. In every PriceTarget Research report, there is in fact a table like this that shows the peers for the companies selected in just this way. That's a wrap. Until next time, you can visit us on the web at PriceTargetResearch.com, where you will enjoy comprehensive ratings and research, relentless updates and alerts, peer sector and industry reports, and model portfolios tied to key investment objectives. You can also find more of our videos on YouTube at YouTube/PriceTargetResearch. Finally, you can find our content exclusively at metrics.com.